In both fantasy and science fiction, teleportation is a really significant feature. It is an excellent tool for driving action forward without having long breaks where nothing happens. But I often feel that teleportation is so ubiquitous in our stories that we often completely forget to take into account any of its cultural implications. Or rather, we forget to do this when it comes to fantasy. As opposed to a lot of science fiction where the ethics, practicalities and legalities of teleportation are front and centre, fantasy teleportation is often relegated to esoteric hand-waving, powerful individuals making it completely non-universalizable for use across an entire society. So how could instantaneous teleportation as a reality of the world actually affect a fantasy setting? Today I'm going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons, which is one of the most teleportation-happy fantasy settings out there. It should give us some ideas, though, more generally, for fantasy world building that uses teleportation. Teleportation spells universally fall under the Conjuration school of magic, which makes some degree of sense. And many creatures, including hags, dryads and Shadar-kai, who are a playable species even, are able to harness the power of teleportation naturally. Almost every D&D character by level 4 can gain access to teleportation as well through the Fey-touched feat, which doesn't even require the user to be able to use magic. Yes, said teleportation is just a 30-foot hop. But it is worth noting that even being able to teleport 30 feet is a significantly powerful thing. Teleporting 30 feet to the ground instead of falling 30 feet, for example, would save the lives of most common people in a D&D world. But using teleportation to send just one person to one different place is not necessarily the greatest use case of teleportation magic. A significant truth of history is that borders were incredibly important. Arguably much more so than even today, where wars are currently being fought over land borders, and indeed sea borders. Borders between towns, counties, baronies and kingdoms were critically significant because of trade. Very generally, to pass through a landowner's land in most of history, you needed permission. This is kind of a fundamental truth across all historic societies which had a concept of land ownership. You can't just wander around. I mean, God forbid you actually had any goods to trade. Attempting to sell or buy something without the explicit permission of whoever's land you were currently standing on was, for most of history until very recently, a ridiculous impossibility, a criminal act. Even today, some royal charters still active in Britain regulate exactly where a market is allowed to be. This grants exclusivity in local regions to towns like Loughborough, which still relies on a charter from the 1220s to ban any of its neighbouring villages from holding a competing market. Even carrying stuff across someone's land was not usually free, historically. And you would be expected to pay tolls and taxes on those things that you were transporting. Or it was essentially just smuggling. A large part of the purpose of building roads under a feudal system was so that people would pay you to use them. Tolls were first used by Germanic peoples to get some money for their well-maintained mountain routes, which shaved a lot of time and danger off of travel. But the toll has since evolved into a concept and can be placed at any reasonable choke point where people have very few options otherwise. Not only were tolls used at bridges and narrow passes, the toll also became a feature of many cities as well. Bringing goods into or out of a city required some sort of levy or tax, which can be considered as sort of a toll as well, because there are very limited ways to get into a walled city, especially in medieval Europe, for example. Many lords on trade routes relied on these tolls for another source of income, and some of these most important and wealth-bringing passes of road or bridge were guarded specifically by a castle for this purpose. I imagine you start to see a problem once we introduce teleportation to a system like this. Just as an example, on a small scale, using the 4th level spell Dimension Door, a traveller can take themselves and their pack mule, which is a medium-sized creature, across a 300-foot gap, a 300 foot of impassable terrain, completely bypassing a potential toll bridge or toll feature that would cost them quite a bit of money. Avoiding checkpoints in this way might become very, very significant as a method of avoiding taxes while travelling with high tax goods, like silks, or even travelling with illicit substances. But on a broader view, I'm not actually sure that tolls, as such, would necessarily exist in the same way that they do in our modern world. Dimension Door is a 4th level spell, and sure, it does allow you to bypass, your average-sized river, or your average-sized toll bridge, quite significantly, with yourself, your pack mule, and over 400 pounds, or over 190 kilograms of stuff. But this is absolutely nothing compared to the 5th level teleportation circle. More broadly in fantasy media, teleportation doesn't tend to operate within specific distance parameters. Oh, you can go 30 feet, you can go 300 feet. It's much more like teleportation circle, which opens a portal that holds open for a moment and people can pass through it to another space. Distant parameters aren't really seen that much in fantasy media. Instead, the more powerful the mage, the further they can send people around the world, sort of thing. D&D has this very style of teleportation as well in the 7th level teleport spell. This even accounts for the skill of the caster, or the knowledge that the caster has of this new place, in actual fact, in D&D, with a familiarity table, which allows the spell to potentially fail and go disastrously wrong if you're trying to teleport somewhere you've never been before. And while teleport trivializes a lot of the lengthy and dangerous historical travel that we see around the world, especially if you can have a bunch of goods in, say, a bag of holding or some extra-dimensional pocket to take along with you, it doesn't have nearly the same impact as a spell that is 2 levels lower, Teleportation Circle. This has wide-ranging implications for trade, sea routes, and national security, and is only a 5th level spell, meaning that you could definitely expect, 1 to 5 mages in any large enough city to be able to reasonably use this ability. So why am I banging on about Teleportation Circle being world-shaping? Let's look at the effects. From anywhere in the world, you can use up 50 gold pieces worth of chalks and inks infused with gemstones to draw a circle on the ground for a minute, which enables any creature that passes into the circle's space within 6 seconds of the casting to pass through to one of a selection of predetermined permanent teleportation circles on the ground already. There is no hard limit on the volume of stuff you can transport through this 10-foot wide opening that lasts for 6 seconds, as long as you can be carried by creatures, because the spell only transports creatures, and by the rules, that includes the objects and things that they are wearing and carrying. Additionally, it takes a year of regular castings to create a permanent teleportation circle, an endpoint, if you will. Although, on the plus side, studying this sigil sequence for just 1 minute allows a mage to learn it. I've mentioned in another video that it makes perfect economic sense to spend the 18,250 gold pieces, assuming a regular Earth length year in terms of number of days, plus any wizarding expenses that might be incurred, to have your own permanent teleportation circle. Because if this teleportation circle processes enough trade over its entire lifetime of existence to replace just 1 single galley, which is 30,000 gold pieces, it has more than made back the investment. This is, of course, not factoring in the conveniences of near instant trade and personal transportation in, again, instantaneous fashion. It is a given that court mages will spend their times learning the teleportation sigils of their allies' teleportation circles, and that international trade alliances would likely form to take advantage of these opportunities. This creates two major problems. The first we've already touched on a smaller scale, but it's worth thinking this through on a broader and broader scale when it comes to teleportation that can literally span the world. The reality is this: without trade on trade routes, the trade routes do not get invested in and they do not get used. A toll bridge doesn't get defended by a huge hulking castle if people just decide to pay a local mage to take them across the river instead to avoid the toll. On a larger scale, entire trade routes might dry up overnight the moment a permanent teleportation circle is established in a city nearby. If the fastest and simplest way to move goods between point A and point B becomes a teleportation circle, any interstitial previous trading route dies. Why would City A's merchants not band together to utilise a permanent teleportation circle to allow them to transport goods to, say, and from City B? They would pay a high-level mage and a bunch of labourers to carry all the goods that they want transported, and collectively, the price would not be incredibly high if a guild of merchants were able to do this, all sending various different ones of their goods to a new place. Get a bunch of labourers to stand just outside, ready to rush into the teleportation, have the mage cast it at a rate that is reasonable for the individual merchant to pay for instantaneous shipping, and it's gone. And it's there. This has the twinned benefits of instantaneous delivery, elimination of risk of banditry, and avoiding multiple tolls, bad weather, and other delays that can cause shipments to be late or lost. The moment this system gets established, the road between City A and City B dries up. The only trade left on it is small-scale local trade or goods that are so bulky and so low in price that they're not really worth sending through a teleportation circle in the arms of labourers, and they're not really worth stealing or paying huge tolls for either. With loss of trade comes loss of profit for landlords who operate these rural areas in between major settlements, breeding resentments with the other landlords in the city and generally city folk. And all of this then leads to lesser investment from these local rural landlords into trading infrastructure, which creates a vicious cycle that degenerates a trade road within a generation. Certainly within a few years we would start to see disparity created between landlords entirely dependent on how close their territory is to a teleportation circle. And as investment lessens in the local roads, the roads get worse, more dangerous, more infested with, say, monsters, and local communities get more and more isolated from one another. But we're still at too small a scale. Countries no longer need to have their main economic hubs on convenient trade routes on rivers or by the sea. Instead, capitals can be centralised and designed specifically for logistics and defence. Philip II's relocation of his Spanish court to Madrid in 1561 is kind of a perfect example of what I mean by this. While it is likely that import taxes are still paid on things teleported into a new place, the fact of the matter is that international teleportation circle networks completely cut some entire nations out of the ability to profit off of international trade. That would formerly have gone right through their borders. Since there's no tangible downside to using a teleportation circle to get to the other side of the world, as opposed to, just your neighbouring country, tensions and rivalries may spark up among various different countries because of this global trade. The largest part of the Ottoman Empire's success as a nation was in its international trade-focused agenda. It sought to link Mediterranean Europe to the Silk Road and therefore to the Asian continent, and positioned itself as facilitator and exponent of free trade across the entire Eurasian continent. It's not an exaggeration to say that the entire empire's economic prosperity relied on its ability to foster and encourage free economic trade within its borders from the international community. And the empire became well enriched by the two sides' appetites for each other's stuff. Yet, the moment that an Italian mage and a Chinese mage both seek to make a teleportation circle and get in touch with each other to make that trade happen a little quicker, almost instantly, the entire Silk Road, and indeed the Ottoman Empire's far-reaching claws, dry up. With teleportation circle on the table, access to sea routes, land trade, and generally historic trade routes becomes largely irrelevant, at least for the highest ticket items, the things that people are most eager to get, which is where most of your taxes and tolls come from. And navies become less important as well, because you don't need them to safeguard your trade routes anymore, just your foreign holdings. Once a critical mass of teleportation circles is achieved, the mass globalization of wealthy nations is inevitable. And this brings us to a larger issue: trade alliances. Historically, language, culture and geography all play significant roles in the establishment of a trade alliance. The Hanseatic League, for example, unified traders and trading cities across the North and Baltic Seas, using the lingua franca of Middle High German and their geographic proximity to each other to essentially control most of the trade going on in the North Sea and the Baltic. This helped establish a shared identity among many of the trade cities that formed part of this huge Northern European trading bloc, a shared cultural identity that still exists today. But with rapidly increasing globalization and the proliferation of discussion through the common language, which is pretty much a universal concept in most D&D settings, simply because it makes playing the game a hell of a lot easier. If everyone speaks the same language or can speak the same lingua franca in common. Geographic proximity means less and less. In theory then, this means that even a single city can break from a feudalist norm and join an international trading market as a significant player. In reality, I would expect that we would actually see significant trading alliances forming within some of the wealthiest places on Earth, joined with each other through these teleportation circles and creating a sort of small club, very significantly gatekeeping anyone else from joining their little trade alliance. This may well lead, therefore, to a group of 5 to 10 nations or free cities gaining control of the vast majority of the high-end trade in world goods, and using a collection of satellite towns to feed their vastly growing populace in these great cities, and probably using these satellite towns as well as trade links on a smaller scale to local spaces who all want in on a slice of this ultra-wealthy place's pie. More than even an industrial revolution, this would concentrate the population in urban centres incredibly quickly and denies the ability for places outside of the market to freely participate within it, within the global market of high-end goods, because it is very likely that these places would want an exclusive monopoly on this kind of trade. It's the equivalent of those market towns with charters that we mentioned earlier, just writ large. Trade is essentially monopolised in a place's surroundings and all brought in to enrich that one location that has the special relationship. Enriching one city by potentially eliminating the power of multiple nations around you. Smaller, more local and geographic trade alliances would probably also appear that would enable places to survive despite this globalized trade alliance. But this would likely lead to a broad class disparity, the likes of which we would only really see in our modern world. Great centres of supreme opulence surrounded by a collection of satellite farming towns to feed the populace, and then empty wilderness with old trade roads going to dust and the odd bandit taking a shipment of wool every so often from the local farmer who's trying to get it to a satellite town. The second issue that I mentioned a lot earlier is also related to this. How do you stop a resentful enemy from ruining everything you have by using your teleportation circle without your permission to launch a raid on your city, on your centre of opulence? After all, you can probably take a small army through a teleportation circle in 6 seconds if they're organised enough, or, 3 to 6 individuals armed to the teeth with magic and murderous intent. Well, let's look specifically at the wording of teleportation circle. Firstly, you can open a portal to a permanent teleportation circle of your choice as long as you know the sigil sequence. This is relatively trivial. No matter how secret you try and keep your city's sigil sequence, giving it out to foreign mages for the purposes of trade and needing that trade to continue for the wealth of your city means that there's no way that this isn't getting out through bribery, espionage, or betrayal. But this is the key. Any creature that enters the portal instantly appears within 5 feet of the destination circle, or in the nearest unoccupied space if that space is occupied. An occupied space is usually here defined as one that contains a creature or an object. Water usually doesn't count in occupying a space, neither does air. Although I imagine fluids of certain viscosity might work to block a space and make it considered occupied. Here are some simple ways to blunt or stop any invasion using a teleportation circle. First, as general policy, your circle should be closed to unexpected visitors. With the availability of sending as an infallible, if you're on the same plane, a method of instantaneous communication between two parties that are therefore able to trust each other because they know each other, trusted allies should be able to pre-arrange teleportation times and a general schedule for when the portal is to be opened. At all other times, the circle should be unavailable for use. There are a few ways to do this. There are a few ways to make the portal inaccessible. You put a gigantic metal box on top of it, or cover the entire room in a layer of sand, for example. This means that the portal is simply harder to use when it is out of commission. But just pouring a bunch of sand over it, covering the entire portal's surface, doesn't stop it from being useful. Because a teleportation circle, even buried under a mile of rock, still works. You just appear in the nearest unoccupied space. This is where I should probably mention that I do actually use a house rule for teleportation circles specifically because it just makes sense in my mind. And some of the points in the next section do assume that that house rule is in place. Honestly, I can't believe it's not part of the spell already, but essentially, if you are using the spell to transport from one permanent circle to another permanent circle, you don't have to expend the material cost. It seems simple, it is really, really quite helpful and makes vast scale trade much, much easier between two cities, which I think is kind of the point. Also, why would you bother redrawing an entire teleportation circle when there's one, potentially 5 feet away from you that you could tap into and use using some form of the magic? Anyway, under my system, it's quite a cheesy trick for a one-way teleportation ride, for example, to have a portal buried under a mile of rock. They will appear on top of the rock and be unable to activate that teleportation circle again to get home for free. But we can manipulate where people are going to end up, depending on what the nearest unoccupied space actually is. Our metal cube from earlier. Let's say a 30 foot by 30 foot by 30 foot metal box with 2 foot thin walls and floor, placed directly on top of a teleportation circle. This is a pre-made prison for anyone who tries to teleport in at the wrong time before the box is wheeled away when the circle is deemed open, and you'd better hope they're willing to talk, communicate and surrender before they suffocate in there. Perhaps the most efficient way to do this is a dome directly above the circle with a floor that is possibly, maybe a foot deep with water, just so that any attempts to draw a new teleportation circle are going to fail because you can't really pour chalks onto water and expect to create some sort of accurate sigil. Alternatively, have an underground chamber directly underneath the floor that holds your teleportation circle. And once the entire room is filled with, say, sand, the nearest unoccupied space is this underground chamber. You can even use this method for regular travellers as well, creating an underground chamber which is kind of a processing facility, which would actually have the added benefit of protecting your teleportation circle from tampering and any nefarious deeds, keeping it permanently covered and having the nearest possible space be a processing facility makes an awful lot of sense. Better still, you could have a permanent anti-magic field inside this processing facility to ensure that anyone teleporting in unauthorized is almost instantly trapped. And that anti-magic field, of course, does not include the teleportation circle because it's simply in the nearest possible open space. It's cheesy, but by the rules it absolutely works. Cover up your teleportation circles and build a separate room to catch people when they do something nasty, like teleporting in when it's closed. But if we're going to use relatively high level magic to protect our teleportation circles, the absolute king is Private Sanctum. This 4th level spell blocks anyone from scrying or divining to see your sigil sequence while the spell is active, which is a really handy bonus if you don't want enemy mages learning it by simply looking. It also blocks any planar or teleportation based travel within the area while also lasting for 24 hours. Want to totally disable a teleportation circle, making it completely useless for anyone who even tries to use it as the target of their spell, not simply trapping your enemies in an underground box, making it so that no one can travel in using your teleportation circle. Private Sanctum is the solution. Likewise, if you find an enemy's teleportation circle and you're worried that they're going to call reinforcements, Private Sanctum is your best friend. But that's a topic for another video. The truth is, teleportation is a complex topic, regardless of genre. In sci-fi, your main concerns may be practicality, ethics, and whether you're the same person once you've been disassembled and reassembled. But in fantasy, our main concern really should be if any sort of semi-feudal world can survive contact with even 1 or 2 of these teleportation circles. A feudal system cannot necessarily survive contact with instant communications and instant teleportations without morphing into something very, very different, a truly globalized international economy, perhaps overnight. Besides, a world with great towering cities and yet deprived, desperate wilderness in between them. Grand class disparities and a guaranteed prison break anytime you try to teleport somewhere without permission. A world of disgruntled rural nobles and wealthy merchants price fixing and taking advantage of international trade relationships. A land where cities dropped from the International Alliance lose half of their wealth overnight. That sounds like a world ripe for adventure to me. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.